Just very briefly, so the main theories of crisis theory are underconsumption, which is just very simply that the working class isn't being paid enough to be able to afford to buy the commodities that capitalists sell. So reformism is the answer: increase wages, increase taxes, problem solved. The other one is the disproportionality theory, which basically argues that if capitalism and production and distribution isn't regulated properly by the state, that you will get a disbalance in supply and demand within and throughout, between and within branches of industry across the economy. Again, it's more complicated than that, but just very briefly. So Grossman is arguing against this. This is what he's taking on. And essentially, these two arguments are saying that capitalism can accumulate harmoniously, or capital can accumulate harmoniously and indefinitely, so long as it's properly regulated by the state. So it's arguing for social democracy. He's saying that's not the case. Capitalism has a tendency to break down of its own accord and goes into crisis regularly. So Marx talks about the average recession striking sort of every 10 years. And so Grossman is arguing that in Capital, Marx demonstrates this breakdown tendency.
The death of God is about the drying up of a horizon of meaning and of a whole form of human life.
Where do we stand in the illusion it makes? What kind of space are we invited into?
The material relations between people become social relations between things. When we look at toasters, corn, and TVs,
we still, to a large extent, live in the interregnum between worlds, if you will, or between paradigms. Not many people in the history of the world have faced that.
Diet Soap is a Sublation Media podcast.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to a special episode of the Diet Soap podcast. We are launching Ted Reese's new book, The End of Capitalism, The Thought of Henryk Grossman. This book is obviously very close to my heart because I solicited it back when we were the evil people who had stolen control of Zero Books. And I'm really proud to see that it's come out, and it's a really enjoyable read. It launches into a really no holds barred argument right from the start. So I'm really pleased to have Ted Reese here. And if anyone is watching, this is my very first time doing a Twitch stream. So I'm sure that I've got this just totally wrong. But if you want to ask questions of Ted, I highly recommend that you do. Ted's really interested and open to answering any questions. I also have with me the Swoletariat, who you may know from Twitter, as I know everyone is on Twitter and follows all of us, who has been following Ted's work for some time and will be helping me ask some questions and join into some discussion as well. So Stephen is your real name, apparently. Would you like to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about how you got to know Ted and his work and the work of Henryk Grossman?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, Ashley. I have a YouTube channel called the Swoletariat, where I combine kind of lifting and socialism and Marxism. And the reason I came across Ted's work in the first place was because of your first conversation back at the very beginning of the pandemic in I don't know, it was February, March or something of 2020. And I just found the interview super fascinating, and what Ted had to say was kind of blowing my mind at the time. So I reached out to him and asked him to be on my channel because I had lots of questions. So he suggested I read his book so that I could ask him better questions, more informed questions. So I did that. His book at the time was Socialism or Extinction, about automation and global warming and the End of Capitalism. And so that's where I got familiarized with Grossman's work and with Ted's interpretation of it as it applies today. And so we had an interview. It went great. We've been keeping in touch ever since, and I've been following Ted's work ever since. And the reason I'm here today is because I think Grossman's work is important, and Ted's work on Grossman is important. So first and foremost, I think the reason this book is important is because nobody knows Grossman or his work today. Rick Kuhn and Ted Reese are basically the vanguard of Grossman's revival, as far as I can tell. Marxists love to talk about ideas in terms of their historical context, and it seems like perhaps Grossman's theory of breakdown is kind of a must-have expansion pack of Marxism and Marxist economics, especially, whose time has come. So Marxists spent a lot of time analyzing the current state of global capitalist society, how it got there and where it's likely heading, and what are the overt and underlying forces at play. Marxism is not a hard science, but it takes a scientific approach to this analysis and these questions. So given that, having the correct economic theory is of the utmost importance, I think, especially today, where it might be argued that we are living in the end times of capitalism, as Grossman's work might suggest. Most Marxists today readily acknowledge the depth and unique difficulty of today's crisis, and a lot of them even predicted it. But most of them would balk at the idea that there can be a final breakdown or final crisis of capitalism, as Grossman's work kind of points to. And so pointing out that profitability rose substantially in the 80s and 90s, and substantially again during the pandemic and supply chain inflation crisis is something that kind of most Marxists today will point to as evidence that capitalism can reinvent itself and just keep on trucking infinitely. Now, Derek Varn, a mutual friend or acquaintance of Ted and I, Ted's been on both of our channels. Recently he's been musing, asking, where profits today are actually coming from, and what makes up America's GDP these days. Well, his conclusion is that it's mostly rents, subscriptions, subscription services, fictitious capital floating around, and gambling in the casino of the stock markets. So increasingly less and less from commodity production itself, where value comes from. So superficially, it looks like capitalism is still chugging along just fine and will recover after potentially bigger and long, deep recession by sweeping away the rot like it always does. And it can do this forever, we are told, provided the forces of Marxism are sufficiently weak to bring about their own revolution. But this is what Ted's work is challenging. So personally, I find Grossman's theory both fascinating and intuitive, and I'm sure Ted will get into what exactly that is in more detail. But I'm not an economist, and I've only read Capital Volume 1, once a decade ago all the way through. I'm rereading it now, so I'm not really in any position to meaningfully evaluate the validity of his work against kind of the mainstream view. But every time I ask around about Grossman to try to explain his theory of breakdown to other Marxists, I just get crickets because nobody's really heard of him. He's an unknown entity, and this is why I think this book about his life, Socialism, and Ted's book, Socialism and Extinction, are so important.
And I wanted to say too that you mentioned that we lack kind of this understanding of the breakdown of capitalism within broader kind of leftist circles and even Marxist circles. And this is why people find someone like me kind of a confusing character, because I can sing the praises of capitalism, because I know it can't go on forever. And in fact, the most terrifying thing is that this system can give a lot of wealth. It can produce a lot of wealth, but it destroys it. That's the worst thing. And so people are like shocked, they're like, because they need to say, well, capitalism is really bad and it immiserates you and so on. And this actually works against us. So Ted, I wanted to know, what is it that drove you to getting into the work of Grossman to begin with?
Okay, so thanks for joining me, everyone, and look forward to answering any questions after our discussion. So I was thinking about my starting point was the Labour theory of value, and I was starting to sort of think about, I was reading a lot about technological advance especially automation. And I was kind of like, the conclusion, or the sort of intuitive conclusion was, a fully automated system of production cannot be capitalist, because it would abolish the source of profit, which is capital's theft of the working class's labour time. Obviously, I'm not going to go into all the technical stuff about that, but if we can just take that as a starting point. And so I was starting to think about, well, this system is moving towards its final stages. Obviously, I'm not the only person saying that, but I wanted to try and prove it or try and explain it. And a comrade in an organisation I was in at the time, this was about 8 years ago now, said, if you want to write something about a final crisis of capitalism, then you need to read Henryk Grossman. So I read Grossman's Law of Accumulation and the Breakdown of the Capitalist System, the abridged version, which came out in 1992. This was the first time Grossman's book had been published in English, and the full English version didn't come out till last year. Rick Kuhn published that and had it translated. So this is how little Grossman is known, just in terms of his work being published in English. But when I read the abridged version, I found it very clarifying, a really strong reinforcement of Marx. And I thought, he's really important for clarifying Marx, reinforcing his work, and for rehabilitating Marx. Because I think that the older capitalism gets, the more relevant Marx is going to become again. And so, Grossman is, in Grossman's book, now that I've read the full version, he talks about how Marx is kind of forlorn about his work falling on deaf ears. And Grossman kind of concludes, well, that happened because the crisis of capitalism hadn't become deep enough for it to become relevant enough for enough people, sort of thing. And of course, Grossman ends up experiencing the same fate. He aims to challenge the reformists and the revisionists in the sort of the Second International of the socialist movement, and he's also up against the leading economists in the Communist International, who have a kind of unclear and eclectic crisis theory. They stand for socialism, but they've also got a reformist foreign policy, because they're trying to keep socialism to Russia and the Soviet Union, and so they have this kind of one foot in, one foot out sort of position. And so Grossman becomes important because he isn't recognised by the Soviet Union. He becomes forgotten because he isn't recognised by the Soviet Union. His work isn't defended by the Soviet Union. And I think that because of that, and because he was ignored by revisionists and reformists as well, he gets forgotten, neglected. His work is rejected because it's too economic. It's too based on economics and not enough on class struggle, which we'll get into. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I think the time has come really to try and rehabilitate Grossman, because I think it will help significantly to rehabilitate Marx himself.
And I think also our movement, because I think we are way the hell too obsessed with the kind of surface level phenomena of culture and so on. And there's a really distinct lack of understanding of some of the deeper processes at play. And if we don't understand those processes, we can't fight against them. We can't be prepared when a humongous crisis comes. It's so, regular people, when you think about, like, what do they think of communism? They think of pink-haired lunatics.
Or Stalinists.
Yeah, who
you two make me feel very underdied.
who want power and to impoverish you and to make your life worse, right? And so there needs to be some kind of movement that's capable of taking up that kind of discontent, and that can only the discontent of like just everyday people, and you can only do that actually from a deep understanding of economics, because we have to understand it in order to control it, and we're not there. We're not anywhere near that. So I think this book is a real step in that direction. Stephen, did you want to ask some? You had a few questions you had prepared.
Yeah, actually, speaking of what you just were kind of talking about there, like the deeper understanding of economics. So reading Ted's book, his first book, really helped me clarify and help me understand Marxist economics much better than the first time I had read through Capital at age like in my 20s. I feel like it went over my head mostly. But Ted's book and using Grossman to kind of explain how the labor theory of value and capitalist competition leads to these problems, and capital's own abolition of its source of profit. So to that end, Ted, could you maybe elaborate or explain why overaccumulation is the kind of Grossman sees that as the kind of primary driver of crises, how that relates to the tendency of the rate of profit to fall, and then from there, can you explain why this is a clearer theory than the common understandings of the underconsumption theory, which many Marxists still hold to, and overproduction, which I think most Marxists today will talk about as the driver of crises, and even
it's a humongous question, because you have to have the following. This all depends on a theory called the falling rate of profit, which most people don't really understand.
Yeah, I mean, just very briefly. So the main theories of crisis theory are underconsumption, which is just very simply that the working class isn't being paid enough to be able to afford to buy the commodities that capitalists sell. So reformism is the answer: increase wages, increase taxes, problem solved. The other one is the disproportionality theory, which basically argues that if capitalism and production and distribution isn't regulated properly by the state, that you will get a disbalance in supply and demand within and throughout, between and within branches of industry across the economy. Again, it's more complicated than that, but just very briefly. So Grossman is arguing against this. This is what he's taking on. And essentially, these two arguments are saying that capitalism can accumulate harmoniously, or capital can accumulate harmoniously and indefinitely, so long as it's properly regulated by the state. So it's arguing for social democracy. He's saying that's not the case. Capitalism has a tendency to break down of its own accord and goes into crisis regularly. So Marx talks about the average recession striking sort of every 10 years. And so Grossman is arguing that in Capital, Marx demonstrates this breakdown tendency.
I want to remind you that GCAS is Sublation Media's one and only sponsor. They are an educational institution offering accredited degrees, and they are running seminars in critical theory, psychoanalysis, communication, philosophy, and literature. Upcoming seminars include Rocky Gangle on Spinoza's ethics, Keith Faulkner's seminar on the genealogy of ideas, including lectures on Nietzsche, Foucault, and Deleuze, Emma Lee Russin on George Bataille's Religion Without Religion, and many others. If you're interested in a radical education, follow the link to GCAS in the description. Supporting GCAS is a good way to support Sublation Media.
So there was a Austrian Marxist called Otto Bauer, who in 1913 produced one of these schemas, and it showed he only did it for 4 years, and after 4 years, it showed that the rate of profit did tend to fall, but that there was no collapse in production because it was satisfying the amount of additional capital needed alongside the amount of additional expenditure on wages, so employment, and the amount of profit that would go to the consumption of the capitalists, which is the incentive for being a capitalist. So the schema basically creates a pure version of capitalism. So you've got constant capital, which is the value of the means of production. You've got variable capital, which is the value of the outlay on wages. You've got 100% constant rate of surplus value, which is the amount that's being the amount of labour time effectively that's being appropriated from labour, and a couple of other things. So you're isolating the key features of the capital relation, such as the industrial capitalists, which are treated as one whole class, and then you've got the productive working class, i.e. the commodity producing working class. All other classes are discarded at this provisional stage. So Grossman follows this pattern on. You'll have to read the book and his book to grasp this properly. I'm just summarising it very quickly and simply. But so Grossman goes beyond the 4 years that Bauer produced to see if actually his own schema was flawed or not. And after 36 years, he found that it breaks down. He finds that a surplus of capital arises, and this is what he calls an overaccumulation of capital, and it's not profitable to reinvest. So there's no point in trying. The incentive to reinvest it disappears because it's not profitable to do so. And obviously, capitalist production is based on this profit motive. Alongside that surplus of capital arises a surplus of labour, a portion of the working population that becomes unemployable, and the consumption fund for the capitalists also disappears. So from this, Grossman draws the conclusion that this produces the class struggle or intensifies it. So he's saying that there's a breakdown. He's effectively he's describing a breakdown in the figures in this mathematical schema, and that's why he calls it a breakdown tendency. Now he says, okay, Marx didn't talk specifically about a breakdown tendency, but he didn't actually specifically talk about a theory of value or a theory of wages either. He just explained them in Capital, and investigated them in Capital. So what Grossman is trying to do is to reconstruct Capital and explain it accurately for the first time after Marx. The problem being with everyone else who had written about Marx is that they basically treated Volume 2 of Capital as Marx's empirical conclusions. So after this initial version of pure capitalism that Marx does it with his schemas, he then starts reintroducing the other aspects that were initially discarded to see if this counters the breakdown tendency. So Grossman does the same thing. So the main one is devaluation. So you get this overaccumulation of capital, the system goes into crisis, you get panic selling because obviously people start tightening their belts. The panic selling means that capitalists have to reduce their prices, but that then means that commodities, which includes means of production, can then be bought up cheaper than they could before, and so that gets the ball rolling again. And you can then start expanding production, innovating, merging companies more cheaply than you could before. So Grossman's showing that what the other Marxists were doing, or the revisionist Marxists were doing, were only talking about value, the value composition of capital and the simplified version of it in volume 2 of Capital, whereas volume 3 went on to demonstrate the more technical side that interacts with the value side, and to demonstrate that despite these counter tendencies, the breakdown tendency will always eventually re-emerge. They can only postpone the breakdown tendency for so long. So this disproved the underconsumption theory, and Grossman actually argues that underconsumption is part of the solution to any crisis, because it pushes down the average wage, and wages eat into profit margin, so therefore it's part of the solution. And it also shows that the disproportions that arise are an almost permanent feature of capitalism, because these crises makes the crisis of over-accumulation, which is also a crisis of overproduction, or you could think of overproduction as the same thing, or a symptom of over-accumulation.
Okay, so
yeah.
one, overaccumulation is the primary, and overproduction then is the secondary cause.
Yeah.
Is that what you're saying? Rather than the other way around?
It's effectively the same thing, but you've got to start with the overaccumulation of capital per se. You've got it's capital value that can't be reinvested, so it can't be reinvested because it can't produce a profit. So that value has to be reconverted into value that can be reinvested. So it has to be destroyed, or it has to be devalued. So the surplus value, the surplus capital becomes productive again so long as it is sufficiently devalued. But the overproduction of commodities is a secondary thing, but it's kind of the same thing as well.
I forgot that I muted my mic, so I've been asking questions. And so could you explain what that means, in real terms, when you say that it has to be devalued? Physically, what does that mean?
So just briefly, you've got the reason you get an overaccumulation of capital, and this overaccumulation of the surplus. You've got too much surplus of capital value relative to the amount of surplus value or value that's being generated by the exploitation of the working class. Because what happens is you get the crisis, you innovate and expand production, and therefore you get more, with every cycle, you get more capital relative to the amount of workers being employed. So therefore, as the system gets bigger, the workers collectively, in terms of their labour time, have to work harder to reproduce the system on an expanded scale. So when you get an overaccumulation of capital and it has to be devalued, you have to cheapen it. You have to make it cheaper. And there are obviously different ways of doing that. Innovation itself will cheapen commodities, because the more abundantly we produce, inversely prices tend to fall. You don't really have to be a Marxist to understand that. That's a pretty general idea within economics. So yeah, you can devalue your capital through innovation. You can let it go disused, and therefore you're no longer spending any of your outlay on it, and it's cheaper to let it go disused and to start investing somewhere else. Because, and that's what we've seen a lot with outsourcing since the 80s, if you're trying to pay your workers less than they were before, then they're likely to resist. So it's easier to just shut down production, move it somewhere else, and employ workers that were already on very low wages, because those workers will be getting paid more than they were before. Mm-hmm. So it's all relative in that kind of way. And then you can just have wars and destroy. Obviously, you can destroy capital that way, and create new profitable opportunities, because the old capital has been destroyed, and this creates breathing room for new accumulation. And that's something that Grossman was very keen on explaining, because no one else after Marx had really explained war on a capitalist basis.
Yeah, this is something that really, really interests me, because I know we need to move on, but I just totally selfishly, I want an answer to this. I have been saying for many years, anyone who's been following my stuff, I've been saying, I'm afraid that a war will come because of the enormous overaccumulation of capital, that the only way, it's not even enough anyway, but the only hope one might have is to just destroy, to just flatten continents as we did in the Second World War, in order to reinstigate another round of accumulation. And there's a bit in the Grundrisse where Marx says war is a bit like the capitalists dropping a third of production into the ocean or something like that. And then he says nothing else. And I want to know about this. And I actually suggested to you, Ted, that we should write a book about why capitalism needs war, because I think, and then, maybe it was self-fulfilling prophecy, where as soon as, I was primed to see any conflict coming, I said, yes, of course, conflict is coming. But when Ukraine started up and people were saying, no, mutually assured destruction, it will remain a proxy conflict, I thought, they might flirt with the possibility of world war again, because mutually assured destruction just might be really, really profitable. So could you, sorry, you wanted to jump in.
The problem with nukes is that the destruction cause might make it so that you can't be more productive later on, right? If you destroy everything, you can't really rebuild in an area where everything's been nuked and there's radiation. So you kind of eliminate the possibility of reevaluating.
Yeah, I don't think they want to nuke other countries in particular. I mean, partly the problem is capitalists don't understand the system themselves. They are responding to competition over profit as well. So the overaccumulation of capital also intensifies competition between capitalists, and that can raise to the level of between nation states, because corporations are based in certain nation states. And so Grossman gives the example of World War One, where he quotes another book where it says that 35% of the world's wealth was destroyed in World War One, and that basically that is like a way of accelerating the devaluation of capital, because what you get anyway with capital is a lot of moral depreciation, where the obsolete commodities become devalued and cheapened, and therefore can either be liquidated and put back into production that way, or they can be bought up on the cheap by the richest capitalists. So that keeps the cycle going, or gets it going again. So yeah, I've argued that a world war wouldn't be able to save capitalism this time, but that doesn't mean there's not going to be very big wars before the possibility of stopping a world war arises. The reason I don't think a world war can save capitalism this time is, I mean, the point Stephen made about nuclear war is obviously very, horrible to think about, because how does anything come back from that?
Yeah. Well, the key thing to understand is that, exactly as you said, they don't know what they're doing. Nobody starts World War II because it's like, oh shit, we're in a crisis. How are we going to get out of it? Let's just blow everything up. No one's doing that. But the pressures are so great that it leads to these enormous conflicts. And so the pressure becomes greater and greater, that very stupid things could happen. It's not like someone says, oh, we'll have to nuke the world and build it again. It's like, well, my oil is not profitable, and I can't sell it to Europe profitably, and so on. And so the pressures become very, very great. So that's the thing, that there's no plan, and that's scary.
Well, if I try and simplify it, so you've got the value of capital and the value of surplus value, and when you've got a crisis, the surplus value is down here somewhere. So to solve the crisis, you need to get the surplus value back up, but you also want to devalue the capital so that they do this again. So you're getting the balance, and then you're getting the surplus value back over and above the value of capital, and then accumulation is in healthy order again. So those are the two things that capitalists are trying to achieve, and innovation will innovation will cheapen the cost of reproducing labour. You know, it will reduce the cost of living, at least in relative terms, and therefore you can appropriate more surplus value from the labourer that way. So that gets the surplus value up. You can expand the number of people employed as workers, either by proletarianizing parts of the middle class, or just employing people who are unemployed or weren't employed in productive production before. But there comes a point where the overaccumulation of capital is so great that to sufficiently devalue capital in the time that they need, because the crisis is getting so deep, like war, the pressure to go to war becomes really intense. But also that can express itself in, like Cecil Rhodes said, you know, to prevent a civil war here, we need to wage war abroad, and then, you know, you collect the tribute and distribute it at home, you know, to prevent the civil war. So that kind of probably is, you know, the ruling class is how the ruling class tends to think about it.
So we've talked about overproduction not being a realistic understanding of crisis. But there are people who claim that the falling rate of profit, the fact that there's just profit that can't be invested sufficiently, they claim that this is a fundamentally flawed theory of Marx's. So I'm not sure. Are we at the point now where we can say whether or not this is a flawed theory? Do you feel like we need to explain it a little bit more exactly why the falling rate of profit is the best understanding? Perhaps you could maybe just give a little pitch for why we need the falling rate of profit, as it's just the best possible understanding besides what we've already said about overproduction.
I think it's the best one in terms of being able to explain why capitalism is unsustainable, because there are a lot of studies now that show that the historical rate of profit, or the secular rate of profit, if you want to call it, is trending downwards. And so there's one by Esteban Maeto, who estimated that the average global rate of profit in the 1870s was 43%, I think, like across that decade. But in the 2000s, it had dropped to 17%. And of course, the rate of profit goes up and down, like depending on various aspects of the system and it's the stage of its development. But if you aggregate it out, the average it's clearly, which way is going to make more sense? Yeah, it's clearly doing that on average. But Grossman does point to the massive profit as well being the problem, and trying to explain what the rate of profit actually is, because we just think of it as the return relative to the amount that was invested. So the return relative to the capital advanced. But what is this actually expressing? And that's something Grossman tries to get at. And he's arguing that the massive profit, even though it tends to rise absolutely because we're producing more, it falls relatively compared to the overall capital initially advanced, or what you could also call the value of capital, or the value of the means of production, which need to keep expanding. Because if you're not preserving the amount of capital, then you can't expand it, and vice versa. If you're not expanding it, you can't preserve that value. Because the more we innovate, the less prices of production fall. And so also what's happening is the amount of profit contained within each average commodity is also falling as well. So the more abundantly we're producing, the less profit per commodity. But how do you offset that? Well, you have to produce even more, because that increases the massive profit. But then it just intensifies this problem with the massive profit falling relative to the massive capital value. And so you get this decline in the rate of profit.
Does okay, so Marxists and economists will often say that capitalism can just attack the working class, do austerity, do neoliberalism, and to restore its own profitability like it did in the 80s and 90s. We saw a big bump up, and then again during the pandemic, we saw a huge consolidation and of
Transfer of wealth.
transfer of wealth, yeah, and some restoring of profitability. Does it matter, as I mentioned in my intro, does it matter if the profits generated are from fictitious capital, from swishing money around, from government intervention, from rents, or the fact that less and less of it is coming from actual commodity production, and surplus value, where value is created? Does it matter where they get their profits from?
Yeah, it does. I mean, any capitalist can increase their profits by taking profits from elsewhere that were created elsewhere. They can boost their own bottom line by doing that, by centralizing capital and concentrating it into few. So the system needs to do that. So you get this underproduction of surplus value and an overaccumulation of capital. How do you offset that? Well, if the system's not producing enough surplus value, then you've got to take it, you've got to effectively redistribute it from below upwards. So that's one of the ways of overcoming the crisis, both to sustain the value of capital and the capitalist's wealth, own personal wealth. So, but that won't solve the crisis at all. It will just deepen the social crisis of capitalism by making a bigger part of the population poorer, and it does nothing to address the actual question of producing value. I mean, effectively, it's a way of increasing the rate of exploitation, but it's not doing it at the point of production. Was that confusing then?
No, sorry. My husband's great grandmother, is staying with us, and she's like 100 years old, and she doesn't know how to speak English either. And she's just walked in and asked me, "What? Do
you got any questions?"
Sorry, I'm so sorry. So I'm afraid that I may have missed that. So please, Stephen, go ahead.
Yeah. So maybe I'll use this opportunity then to kind of play devil's advocate for the underconsumptionist. I was just talking to our friend Sam, the MMTer, because his point is that investment is a function of demand, and it's all about demand. So capitalists will invest if there is demand. So if capital is overaccumulated because it can't find profitable investments, does that not indicate a lack of demand for that product? And so if you have a lack of demand for that product, doesn't that imply an overproduction of commodities? But if the government is the currency monopolist and can purchase land, labor, and capital, so if there's a profitability crisis, can't the government just invest in companies, buy up land, buy up labor, do what it needs to, inject currency into the system, do what it needs to restore profitability? Obviously, this would be kind of this isn't adding to surplus value directly, but it's kind of padding the areas where there's lack in the economy, and so profit can keep going, right? If you give enough money and to the poorest people in the working class, then they can keep buying products, right? Why can't they just do that indefinitely?
I mean, that theory needs to be proven, kind of scientifically in the way that Marx did, with methodically, and that it hasn't been. You're only kicking the can down the road. You might be able to increase demand, and therefore the number of commodities produced can expand, and that definitely plays a role. I'm not saying it doesn't, but it doesn't. It can only postpone the onset of the next crisis. But it could also speed it up, because if you're raising the wages above the value of labour power, then you're actually eating into the massive profit that could otherwise be put towards the expansion of production. So and private production, production that is privately owned. So I mean that's the answer in a nutshell. I'm happy to debate Sam again if he wants to.
Yeah, he's itching actually to chat with you again.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a lot of things that people will say, oh, well, but capitalists will just do X and capitalists will just do Y. It's interesting because a lot of these things are actually dealt with as countervailing tendencies, talked about in Grossman's work and in Capital Volume 3. And they ultimately will not win out against this sort of irresistible tendency for the rate of profit to fall. And one thing, too, that a lot of people have been talking about, obviously, now is this sort of PMC thesis, the role of the professional middle classes. And what a lot of people don't realize is that Grossman actually talks about the role of the middle classes. And so does Marx when he talks about them in the second volume of Capital, which Grossman draws on, as these sort of people that are essentially parasitic on capital in that they're funded out of surplus value. And so they appear in kind of superficial antagonism with capital, because they're always trying to big up their role, and capital is always trying to reduce it and throw them down into the proletariat, because they ultimately eat into surplus value. And I wondered if just, I know that we're kind of blowing through a lot of topics here, but I know a lot of people are interested in that. And I wonder if I really wanted to make sure that I asked you if you had anything to say about that whole discussion. Do you think that dynamic explains anything that we see today in politics?
I mean, the tendency, this is where the technical side is as important as the economic or value side. The more automated production gets, the more deindustrialized the working class becomes, and it gets pushed into services. We know that around 80% of the economy is now in the services sector in Britain and the US and elsewhere. So the working class is really becoming, to a certain extent, a non-productive class. And this is the problem. This is why I think we're coming towards the end of capitalism as an economic system, as a mode of production. It's basically exhausting its own ability to reproduce itself. So the sort of consumer class, I mean, Grossman refers to them as a consumer class or a third persons. And yeah, they're not producing surplus value because they're not part of production. They do important roles to service capital, but not to actually produce it. And so their consumption, their wages, is paid out of surplus value produced by commodity producing workers. During neoliberalism over the last 40 years, the quickest or the most expanding employment sector has been the commercial sector. So a lot of workers have moved into coming out of Keynesianism, where you had a lot of state-owned production, even in Britain and America and France and so on. A lot of those workers have moved into services and the commercial sector. So that, the middle class has actually swollen, and you've had this there's almost been, because on the one hand we've had a lot of lumpenization, where workers are thrown out of work almost permanently, and are very, very poor. And then on the other hand, there's been a large chunk that almost has and I kind of think of this as almost a pre-socialist tendency, where there's a kind of post-proletarian state that a section of the working class has entered because production has become so abundant. and the number of workers needed for production has fallen. So that there's that two-way thing going on. But in recent years, there looks like there's now an absolute decline in the number of workers being employed in the commercial sector, because even those jobs can be automated away, or the companies can't afford them. So companies like Nike are reducing the number of people they're sponsoring, number of sports people they're sponsoring. For example, that's just like an easy example to use. So yeah, I think that's a really complicated area that we haven't really nailed down yet, but that's roughly my answer.
Do all English people call it Nike instead of Nike?
Yeah.
So weird.
Well, it hasn't got a Y on the end of it, has it?
Well,
Or
in
Greek,
well, the thing is, in Greek, it's Niki, right? So it's still wrong, though, because there's no I in victory in Greek. Anyways, okay. So I also wanted to make sure that we got into some of the most important aspects, which is there, I mean, we've already talked about some of it. Obviously, long-term trends point to the fact that the rate of profit does appear to be falling. And what convinced me was that I saw bourgeois economists being like, oh, there's this weird thing happening, like just totally innocently. And of course, the falling rate of profit was completely taken for granted in classical economics. It was a puzzle that needed to be solved and answered. It wasn't something that Marx uniquely came up with and pointed to. It was something that he was also trying to explain. And it's kind of being hand waved away. But what other evidence is there for this? Because there are some things that you point to in the book that I was really convinced by. But then when I went to try to explain it to like my husband, who's a total normie, he was like, what do you mean interest rates are falling? The interest rate for our house just went up. So I wondered if you could kind of explain some of the, just for smooth-brained such as myself among us, what evidence is there for this? And how do you explain some of the things like interest rates appearing to go up again, that kind of thing?
Okay, so there's a lot of empirical evidence that I use in all of my work to try and back up Marx's argument that capitalism is unsustainable, works towards its own dissolution, and therefore necessitates a new mode of production called socialism. One of them being a study, fairly recent, very comprehensive study showing that the average interest rate has fallen towards zero over the past 700 years, which is about how old capitalism is if you include the early rudiments of early capitalist production. So this interest is a form of profit. It's obviously it's a rentier form, but it eats into the profit margins of the industrial capital. So the banking sector and the landlords need higher interest rates for their own profits, their own consumption as well. That again, Grossman actually says that the interest rate tends to reflect the rate of profit more or less. So again, this downward average on the average interest rate, again, it goes up and down depending on how they react to a crisis. So with inflation, they want to, so the way they get interest rates down is to print money, use that money to buy up debt, whether it's government debt or corporate debt, and that pushes up the price of bonds, which is debt, and lowers the interest rate. So when inflation gets out of hand, because there's so much surplus capital that they're trying to reconvert into production, and the actual production can't keep up with that. That's what's actually happening now with inflation. They are trying to push interest rates up to lower demand and therefore get inflation down. The problem is
a recession.
Yeah, they're going to have. I mean, what they seem to be doing is with 2020, the stock market crash in March 2020 led to a very steep recession, but it only lasted for 2 months. A technical recession is 6 months or 2 quarters of a year. And so we still haven't actually had a recession in the US or Britain since 2008, 2009, which is crazy to think about. But they managed to do so, because what they need to do is cheapen production to try and get things going again. But they don't want a mega recession like we had in 2008, because they know it risks tipping over into something worse. So it seems to me like they're trying to do it bit by bit. So if you can get a 2-month recession, but a steep decline in prices, then you can get the system going again. But obviously, what we're seeing is, the crisis developing in a different way in terms of inflation. But inflation can help capitalists because it can torch debt and wages to some extent. It can lower the wages of the working class relative to their consumption needs. So interest rates will play a part in all that, and how they respond to the crisis. But overall, interest rates are being forced down. It's a secular trend. So there's some other empirical ones that I point to. So debt to GDP is higher now than it was at the end of World War II. Mm-hmm. And we're in what Guy Summers, a financial expert, has called the everything bubble, where every asset class is in a debt bubble. That's never happened before.
And the reason why they can't raise interest rates is that those bubbles will implode.
That's right. They can't. Yeah. They're trying to edge them up very gradually, mm-hmm. But inflation seems to be going up anyway, even when they do that. But the reason they don't want to put them too high is because it will make debt more expensive to repay, and then everyone will see that the government's going bust. They're not going to get the returns on their bonds, which are negative a lot of the time anyway, or they have been in the last decade. That's been a unprecedented development. So a few other things. The average GDP, gross domestic product, in the high income countries has tended to slow down decade on decade for the last 50 years, and isn't much higher than 1% over the last couple of decades. The US and UK currencies, the dollar and pound sterling, have devalued by nearly 100% in the last 100 years. And most of that has been since 1970. So it's devalued at an accelerated rate. The more productive we've become, the more that's happened. Costs of production seem to be falling towards zero when you look at things like 3D printing, how much it costs to store, because 3D printing, of course, removes such a large chunk of the outlay on wages where it can be used, that the price of production has fallen rapidly where it's been. So the more that generalizes, the more like the crisis could deepen once you get over that initial bump or advantage from not paying the wages. And Marx actually says that, because people say to me, well, they can just expand production on the old basis of the method of production, but that's true, and that will sustain the rate of profit at the level it is. But Marx actually points out that the expansion of production actually tends more towards the newest technology, because it raises the productivity of labour and therefore meets the demands of accumulation. There's other pretty big ones as well. The energy return on investment has fallen in a secular trend from 100 to 1. So every 1 unit would get you 100 units back. That was in 1930 during the Great Depression. That's continued to decline down towards zero and is pretty close to zero now in the last studies that have been done on that. So that figure I gave was on fossil fuel, but according to Sid Smith, who did a lecture on this that you can watch on YouTube called "How to Enjoy the End of the World," it applies to all forms of energy production, including renewables. And then there's one more, which is that in 1964, the average US company out of the top 500 its lifespan would be 60 years, but in 2014 it was down to 18 years. So any US corporation that pops up in the top 500 now is not going to last very long. So again, that's another indication that this system is approaching its end game.
You're off again.
Damn, it's because my dog is having nightmares next to me. No, I was going to say, oh, crap, we're screwed, basically, because we've just started a new company. Social media. But you make a really terrifying and engaging case for the end, or like something approaching the end at the moment. But I wondered, what do you say to people that think, well, you're taking a big risk here? Because as the old joke is, Marxists have predicted 10 out of the last 5 recessions. Do you not risk this kind of pseudoscientific claim that, you're saying the end is nigh, and what doesn't happen, you revise, how do you kind of get around that critique? Do you not feel like you're taking a big risk there? You don't even hedge your bets. Like in the book, you're like, I mean, you do say this could be, but you make a really strong case that the end is nigh. I mean, how do you respond to people who think that's pseudoscientific and far-fetched?
I mean, we talk about theory and practice a lot, and I'm trying to combine the two. Like in practice, what is happening? I've just given you the empirical data and evidence that seems to be very compelling. So that for me backs up, Marx's argument that the rate of profit not only tends to fall, but tends to fall progressively. He does say that. Some people, even Marxists, just say, "Oh, well, it tends to fall, but it can also tend to go back up." But the secular trend is that it does go down. All I can do is point to the empirical evidence and then say, "This is what Marx said," and when you look at the two and how they interact, there's a very, very strong case for his ideas being borne out in this empirical evidence. Money being devalued, prices of production falling towards zero, this debt bubble that is consuming everything, the energy return on investment. I don't really know how you can look at all that and go, well, there must be something we can do to reverse all this. Yeah. There isn't, because you can't stop evolution effectively. Like evolution is, encompasses everything, including technology. And Marx's argument is not just economic, it's also technical. It's a certain technical level of production demands a certain type of mode of production. That is what he's saying. And he is convinced that a fully automated mode of production has to be communist. Just as he thought manufacture and the development of modern industry in terms of mechanical mechanisms had to be capitalist. He says that in volume 1. So, like, the solution to, if you don't want this to happen, would be to go back to old methods of production. But they would just evolve again because that's what happens. Like I don't think I'm not an economic determinist. I'm a economic and technical determinist, if you like. I think the two things interact. I think that's what Marx is trying to explain. You get a crisis of value production. The technical side sorts it out. You raise the technical level, and that enables our ability to restore the value side. But the technical side gets so productive eventually that the value side is essentially withering away. You can see that in the devaluation of money, the falling rate of profit, the falling prices of production. It's all there. So yeah, this is historical as well as economic as well as technical. It's all of those things.
Speaking of determinism, though, I wonder if like we could, or you could clarify then how you think Grossman's theory helps us transition into socialism. Because, from some of your tweets and some of the ways you write about it, it seems a little over deterministic that, we're in pre-socialist times and all these trends are kind of creating socialism on their own. So it can sound like, socialism kind of will emerge naturally out of this, this breakdown. Whereas, of course, most Marxists would say, well, no, you need class struggle, and you need, Trotskyists like myself would say, well, you actually need very good leadership. Above all, in order to make this happen.
Yeah, so I mean, I agree with the importance of class struggle. What I'm saying is that capitalism itself, and our own sort of inevitable technical evolution, is producing the basis for socialism. So all the elements are in place in terms of our ability to produce abundant material wealth for all. That now exists. We can do it very cheaply. We can distribute what we make very cheaply, and all the rest of it. And what I'm saying, and what Grossman is saying, that this development produces a class struggle, because as the technical side sort of abolishes the value side, the capitalists are obviously going to try and redistribute what value is left upwards. And so they're going to start attacking the work. It's already been happening for decades, right? But it's intensifying. The ruling class, or the capitalist class, attacks both its competition for one, but also which causes a centralization of capital into fewer hands, proletarianizes a bigger section of the masses. And at the same time, they're attacking the working class. So this class struggle is going on all the time, but the capitalist class is instigating it. And what Grossman is saying is that as that relationship develops, a larger and larger portion of the working class and the mass of people in general will have to stand up for themselves to stop it. So it's a class theory, it's a class struggle theory, but it's explained by the breakdown tendency.
Yeah.
It's not saying, the capitalists are going to just, nationalize all the production at a certain point because they can't do anything else. I do think, Marx does say a portion of the ruling class will switch sides. We'll see if that happens, but because they're going to go bust. Socially, the system's going to become chaotic, and all the rest of it. So it's not an immiseration. I know you wanted to ask about the immiseration thesis, like, do we have a revolution because we're all immiserated?
Yes.
I don't think it's that per se. I think immiseration plays a role, but it's more about people being forced to stand up to protect their own means of subsistence more and more as as all these tendencies progress.
And also it's also relative immiseration too. As you become more and more aware of a world of wealth just right at your fingertips, and you're like, well, this stuff was like really cheap 5 minutes ago. You become more aware of what's being kept from you, and people aren't happy about that. And Marx talks about the crumbs that fall to the working class to get bigger, but they're still crumbs relative. Everything relative to what the capitalist class has is much, much smaller, and you're the one who creates that wealth. So it's about trying to make sure that people are aware of that and fight back against it. And supposedly people will become aware of that possibility. Just it will become obvious. That's the idea. But I want to get to the questions. We've been talking for over an hour now, and I want to make sure that we could address some of the questions in the chat. But I wanted to ask one more question, which is, it struck me recently that a lot of the things that Marx and Engels talk about as being an inevitability of the transition from capitalism to socialism and communism seem to be happening in this nightmare scenario. So like a lot of things sort of wither away, but without anything to replace them. And I wonder, could we have a situation in which the authoritarianism is so strong and the controlled populations are so strong and the class struggle is so unbalanced that you could have a breakdown and all of these things, they wither away into something more horrible? Is that a possibility? Have you ever considered that?
Because the character of the working class is different than it was 100 years ago. We don't have lots of factories and shop floors that bring workers together in direct, conflict with the bosses.
If anything, we're even more atomized.
Yeah, the division of labour intensifies as capitalism progresses, and that's acutely apparent now. Fascism we're already, in a very authoritarian stage of neoliberalism. You might even call it, pre-fascism, or I don't know what you want to call it, but we've seen an obvious concentration of wealth and therefore power, which has been reflected in the policy making and legislation at the state level. And obviously that can continue, because they need to keep concentrating wealth into fewer hands. That's what the system is provoking the ruling class to do, sort of thing. So fascism is definitely a possibility. A horrible version, as horrible a version as we've seen. It's possible. But I don't know that. I can't predict it. And you would expect that any sort of working class attempt to build dual power, for example, would be met with massive resistance from the ruling class, and that would produce. So, if there's a civil war, that's a nightmare scenario on its own. So I don't know what is possible in terms of how bad things get, but it will still be capitalism before it's socialism. It will still be capitalism. It will just be people who have a working class that is very highly unemployed and very poorly paid, whether that's on a universal basic income or something else. It will still be capitalism. It will still be a late stage of capitalism, but something will instigate, a struggle for socialism. It will become, I'm absolutely positive that it will become necessary, because people who work for the state are workers as well, a lot of them. And we've seen a lot of people working for the state being made redundant in the last decade or so. So that is a trend that isn't sustainable. A capitalist state needs to be able to pay its state workers. So I foresee potentially a political crisis where the tax base collapses, and the capitalist state might, if it can't restructure its debt, it might face a situation where it can't employ its state workers, which include soldiers and police and so on and so forth. And that might produce a situation where the socialist movement starts to grow very rapidly. That's speculation, but it's a potential sort of opening that we should be aware of. I'd much rather a political as peaceful revolution as possible out of a political crisis, rather than one where we only get to it when everything's been destroyed, obviously. So that's another reason to get people mobilized now.
On that optimistic note, Stephen, if you wanted to, if there were any questions that you wanted to pull out of the comments, but I'm just going to pull up a couple. So someone has asked, are you saying that nobody except workers in production are involved in the study of surplus value production? What do you define as production? And it seems like an incorrect understanding of an important parameter. So you're saying that only like people who produce physical commodities, I'm not sure, I may be misrepresenting the question, but are these the only people that are involved in surplus value production? And I'll just keep the question up so you can see it.
Yeah, the only people involved in surplus value production are workers who produce commodities for capitalists who then sell their commodities and make a profit. So the surplus value contained in the commodities is realized in sale of the commodities, but the surplus value originates at the point of production, as in the appropriation of surplus labor time. So when we're talking about surplus value, we mean surplus labor time. So the worker works their necessary labor time, and that covers their costs of their living, of their subsistence, and then the rest of the day they're working for the capitalist. That surplus labor time is surplus value that is only realized in commodity sales. So if your work does not involve commodity production, surplus value can't be realized, right? So it's only the commodity producing working class that produces surplus value. I will just add that people who work in services can produce surplus value if they are handling finished or near finished commodities. And I would add that, and this is something Marx stresses a lot more than Grossman, that science has become the helmsman of production. Scientists are involved in commodity production a lot more than they used to be. So I would say the average worker produces less surplus value than they used to, because they're not involved in or like in relative terms, because they're not involved in like the more labor intensive manufacturing that used to be dominate the technical side. But the mass of surplus value is higher because we're producing so much more quickly. Mm-hmm. And that probably means that more of the population is involved in surplus value production, but it's just relatively less per worker.
Yeah. I mean, even like journalism is becoming automated now. Like the listicles that you see, and they're like weirdly written because they're written by robots. So like a lot of services are being automated. I'm just conscious that we're running a little bit out of time, short on time. So someone has asked, out of Grossman's book, what one thing in particular stood out to you that impressed you the most or blew your mind? And for me, it was I have to jump in and say it was the PMC thing, because that was a big question for me. And then to see it in the countervailing tendencies, like really pushing hard on that class, I found that very interesting.
That's a good question. Thing that blew my mind. There is actually in his letter to Formatic, which I cover in one of the chapters, I find really interesting, because this is where he gets more political, and he talks about during the German Revolution, the sort of some of the ultra-left tendencies that came up, that kind of, or sort of foot shooting tendencies that came up in some of what the communists did, and he talks because a lot of the Communist Party, or some of the leadership that emerged in the Communist Party in Germany, talked a lot about betrayal, of the reformists and the revisionists, and Grossman says, well, yes, that's true, but it's also to do with the immaturity of the workers' movement, and also the potential of the crisis didn't get deep enough to incentivize enough people to, convert to the revolution, sort of thing. So I thought that kind of like personified his economic theory in a way.
Stephen, did you want to jump in and add anything?
Yeah, I just had to disagree with that assessment of what the problem was in the German Revolution. I mean, we obviously argue that it was all down to leadership, and that the working class itself was in fact radical enough and would have taken power had they had the right leadership, and that the economic conditions weren't like the German working class at the time was among the most comfortable, I think, and but still was in a position to take power. But it's kind of getting off topic.
I agree that the leadership was a problem, but the fact is that there was betrayal. There was certain sections that betrayed or didn't convert to the side of the revolution effectively, and if they had, then it would have made the leadership's problems a bit more. Would have breeded confidence within any leadership that was there, instead of the situation where they ended up effectively sort of bottling an uprising.
So another question is, a few people have said, you're a determinist, no matter what you call it, you're still a determinist. What do we do? Sit back and wait for technology to do the job? Capitalism has been ripe for overthrowing for 200 plus years. Technology of recent decades has not fundamentally changed this.
Well, I don't agree that capitalism has been ripe for 200 years, because then you're creating another type of determinism, which is capitalism will end when the working class puts an end to it. But when is it going to put an end to it? Just because it gets bored or something. I mean, that's a determinist argument in itself. It's not. Whereas I'm trying to be dialectical. I'm trying to talk about the relationship between the economic and technical sides on the one hand, and the class struggle that this produces on the other. So I would say again that the economic technical side has carried on developing. The production is far more automated now than it was 20 years ago. I think that's visibly evident to most people. I was talking to someone last week who works in an Amazon factory. He said it's 85% automated in there. I welcome people making that sort of challenge, because it gives me the opportunity to try and counter it and try and clear up what I'm trying to explain. But I'm afraid capitalism hasn't been right for 200 years. There have been very few attempts to overthrow capitalism, and even fewer successful revolutions. So I think that's very optimistic to say that it's been right for 200 years. That would suggest to me that it can go on forever, in which case there would be no point in being a Marxist or revolutionary.
There was a question early on, and I can't find it scrolling now, but it was about 3D printers and automation and that sort of thing. It was a question that came up also when I very first interviewed you in the comments on YouTube, which was, well, we can't automate everything. Automation is never going to touch certain aspects of human labor. So how can you say that, how can you sort of big up the role of automation as being the basis of a communist system and so on? People are always going to have to do work, and always going to have to do work that maybe isn't nice work. So how do you make sense of that? Do you think you're being maybe too optimistic about the role of automation in society, or pessimistic?
We don't know that everything can't be automated. We literally don't know that. Another 1,000 years of innovation, what's that going to look like? So you can't say you know that that's for sure that everything can't be automated. Obviously, not everything can be automated in the immediate future. And the capitalist system has the problem of this barrier to productivity growth, which is this surplus of capital that can't be reinvested profitably. So they do have the problem of not being able to generalize automation in the way they would. Although if you solve the crisis, prices fall again, and they can then accelerate the development of automation again. It's very clear in my work that the automation revolution can't be completed by capitalism. The system has to break down before that technological evolutionary development is completed. Socialism has to finish what capitalism started, effectively.
I think also, go ahead.
I think it's also like kind of the point is that, sure, most jobs or a lot of jobs can't or maybe won't be automated, but at the level of commodity production where surplus value is generated, mostly they can.
Yeah.
So that's what matters.
Also, Marx talks about, I can't remember, it's all melded together in my head, I think Capital Volume 2, about the realm of necessity, where he says the realm of necessity will always dominate human beings. We will always have a certain amount of labor that we will always just have to do. But the point is that that could be a very, very small part of our day, whereas now it occupies such a huge part of our day for not really any reason. In a very small period of time, we can generate a very large amount of wealth. And do the things that we need to do, and then we can spend the rest of that time doing work that we actually want to do and feel a calling for, and all that stuff, fish and talk philosophy and all of that stuff in the German ideology. So I wanted to ask if there's any final questions from those who are watching. We still got 10 people here, but just to kind of, I think that was it. Someone wrote a very angry, ridiculous response. Wage labor political subjectivity is determinist. I'm afraid I don't think we've got enough time to really respond to that. So what I wanted to do was, Ted, give you a chance. If you could just sort of round out our discussion. We've touched on a huge range of topics that you deal with in the book. Could you give us just one reason why people need to go out and get it and read it, besides the fact that it's just really good to beef up your theory powers?
Yeah, I mean, I think, Grossman and Marx Grossman talks about Marx being disheartened by his theory not really having the impact and influence he thought it deserved to, and it did deserve to, because it's always relevant just to explain any crisis of capitalism, or the bulk of them, the tendency towards crisis that we experience so often. Grossman had the same fate. What I'm saying now is that both of them are becoming increasingly relevant as capitalism gets older, and that in some senses they're becoming relevant for the first time. And maybe if they were ignored in the past, it was because their theories didn't reach the level of their ultimate manifestation. But I think in our time they will, and perhaps then it will become impossible to ignore them. And I mean, this book is just an introduction to Grossman, because I think, he's not well known enough, and I think his work should be more widely cited in our defense of Marx amongst Marxists. And I think it helps us to rehabilitate Marx. So for all those reasons, I mean, I want to do something more substantial to defend him later on, if I get a chance. But for now, I think this is a really good introduction to help, put everyone on a good footing, a solid sort of basic understanding of the capitalist system and why it can't survive much longer.
Okay, an optimistic or pessimistic note to end on. We will be posting this on YouTube, so for those of you who joined late and maybe wanted to hear the first part of the discussion, you can tune in there. And we can also continue the discussion by liking it and commenting down below. And I know I always sort of trawl through the comments myself. So if you have any additional questions, I'll do my best to pass them on to Ted. But I want to thank everyone for coming, everyone watching. I think we hovered between, a few dozen viewers throughout. And thank you very much to Stephen, and of course to Ted for joining us and for writing this book. So thank you.
Thanks to both of you and everyone who joined in. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much.
Hello. I want to let you know that Sublation Media's official launch date will be Sunday, June 26, 2022. We'll be holding an event for this launch at Project Parlor in Brooklyn, New York. It will run from 3 p.m. to 10 p.m. And Norman Finkelstein, Margaret Kimberly, Pascal Robert, Chris Catrone, Ben Burgess, Jason Miles, Alfie Bound, and a number of other interesting leftist types, including myself, will be there to talk about the left in a time of state and self-censorship. It's a free event. Everyone is invited. And if you live in New York City, I hope to see you there.